Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Soul Focused Radio. This is your host, Martin Friedman, and I am flying solo tonight. I will be for a few episodes, at least during the intro. We're bringing Christin on as part of our transition. And as you know, Cindy has transitioned out of the regular co-host role, and Martina is still our regular co-host as well. But she is going through a transition of her own over the next several weeks. So it's going to be me for a few episodes. And tonight we have a somber episode, an episode that is really discussing another in a long line of deaths of Black men at the hands of police. Today, we're going to talk about it from what we think is a pretty unique, soul-focused angle. I do want to give you a trigger warning. We don't go into graphic detail, but this can be very triggering for a lot of people, just a discussion about this. And we are going to look at it, as I said, through the lens of the Soul Focus Group, which means we're going to look at it through the lens of our subconscious programming, our ability or inability to see humanity in each other. And from the unique perspective of Anuar, we're going to talk about that from a police officer of color who witnessed a lot of violence in many different ways. And we'll speak to the trauma and the cycle of trauma. And then we have Christin, who will also be talking from her perspective tonight. So I'm not going to keep you. I really want to get to it. I think it's very compelling. I think it's a somewhat unique approach to this conversation. And as always at Soul Focus Group, everything we talk about, every angle we approach is an angle to end violence, to end us being out of power, to end these cycles.
There is nothing more powerful than communication, because we all have to do it, and we're all doing it on some level all the time. When we are talking to ourselves or thinking, that's just another word for talking to ourselves, which means that we are doing what? Communicating with ourselves. When we are verbally speaking to other people, our body, or when our body language is demonstrating communication. Communication is so important because the world runs off communication. So when you power up your communication, you essentially power up your life. At the Soul Focus Group, we invite everybody that comes to really delve into powering up their communication, transforming the way they listen, transforming the way they speak, transforming the way they connect to people, because that is where our power is. Power up your communication, people. We all need it.
All right. So we are going to begin our conversation. We have Anuar. How are you doing, Anuar?
I'm doing great, Martin. I'm grateful for being here, and I'm excited to see how this conversation goes today, and to be able to put this out into the world too, for their listeners out there. But yeah, I'm excited about this.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time, and I'm really excited to get your perspective out into the world. And I'm also joined by Christin, our newest co-host of Soul Focus Radio podcast. How are you doing, Christin?
I'm doing very well. I'm happy to be here in this discussion with the two of you. So thank you for having me on.
Awesome. And excited to get your perspective on this too, and any questions that you have as we move forward too. So I'm just going to jump right in. So the way I want to start this conversation is I really want to frame it around how we look at what happens when a Black person is killed by police. And in the 30 years that I've been doing anti-racist work, and as people that listen to this podcast know, I'm transitioning away from anti-racist work and into human solidarity work, which means solidarity with everyone, including solidarity with police. And that's the focus of the Soul Focus Group. So it means us figuring out how we're going to all come together. And over those 30 years, there's been many cases of police shootings. And I've spoken at rallies. I've attended rallies. I've, been interviewed. Certainly Dustin has many times. We've been a part of this work for a really long time. And it's a cycle that just keeps on happening over and over. And so just like everything else with race and racism, we want to take a step back from just being in this cycle that never seems to end. And we want to try to approach this from a different angle. So we're going to talk a little bit about the cycles of trauma that are self-perpetuating between police and communities of color. I would add poor communities in too. But first, Anwar, I know folks have met you in previous podcasts, but just in case this is their first podcast, can you just say a little bit about who you are, just a little bit about your background, especially as a police officer, where you were an officer, for how long, and all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to add in here that again, we're talking about a highly sensitive subject and a highly sensitive incident that just occurred. So for those listeners, just know that we're going to be talking about some stuff that is really raw, in that it really calls us to, as you mentioned earlier when you talked about human solidarity, but it really calls us to digging into our humanity as we're listening to today's podcast. But yeah, Anuar Velazquez, I grew up in part of my life. I grew up in Mexico. So I moved here at the age of 13. My parents and I immigrated to South Bend, Indiana, where I grew up for a part of my life, lived there in South Bend, Indiana, and then attended college at IU. And at a very young age, I would tell anybody that would ask me what I wanted to do. And when I grew up, my automatic response was police officer. That's always what I replied and what I answered and what I stuck with. So in college, I studied criminal justice. I became a police officer at a very young age. I graduated the police academy in 2011. I finished throughout my schoolwork at IU in Bloomington, and then later went on to work for South Bend Police, so the town that I grew up in. I worked there for about just under 3 years. After that time at South Bend Police, I transferred to Westfield Police Department, which those are completely different places. You're talking about one that is urban setting, urban environment, and the other one is the suburbs. Mm-hmm. So yeah, in total, I would say I have about just under 10 years of police experience. I finished my police career as a school police officer, where my passion then shifted, and my purpose was called more to work with the youth. So I went back to school to obtain my master's in school counseling. So my master's in education with a school counseling focus. And ever since then, in 2021, I've been a school counselor. I've been working as a school counselor at the high school level. And most recently, I was just admitted into a PhD program in urban education studies. So that's been a little bit about my life. I'm raising a beautiful 4-year-old girl. So yeah, it's just a little bit about me.
Thanks, Anwar. Appreciate it. So what was your first feelings when you heard about the killing of Tyre Nichols? Maybe what did you think when you first saw it? I don't know if you watched the video or not at this point, but when you very first heard about it, what feelings came up for you?
So, I heard about it. I read a little bit about it. Unfortunately, the stuff that I was reading and the things that I was hearing, it did not really paint the picture of what actually happened in the video, right? So I actually sat with it for quite some time before going back and watching the video, because it is traumatic. So again, for those listeners that have not seen it, just know that it is highly traumatic. And I had to sit with it for quite some time. I actually even told myself at some point that I was not going to watch the video. I told myself that I didn't need to. And it was not a question of needing to. It was more of, do I want to continue to see trauma like that? I mean, I experienced it at a young age personally, witnessed it as a police officer day in and day out. So part of me has really gone on this, what I call trauma cleansing. And as I heard and I read more about it, something told me, or something came up and was like, watch the video. So I did. And it was chilling. It was, if I were to put it in one word, it was inhumane. And again, our focus is so much on that human solidarity piece. And in this video, there was nothing human about it. The way that this young man was treated, the way that this young man was being physically assaulted, it was just completely inhumane.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Christin, I want you to jump in, and, I know you and I have talked, so I know you haven't watched the video, but I'm just wondering if you could just say what feelings came up for you when you first heard about this. What was your initial reaction?
So my initial thoughts or feelings about it was, here's another incident, for one. And for two, I did not want to watch the video or consume any of the rhetoric or the narrative that's behind the incident just for really the protection of my own mental health and sanity, because we've certainly been down this path a lot of times. And I just tried to stay, or have been trying to stay away from it as much as I can. But you know that is nearly impossible, especially in an age of social media, and it's everywhere and everyone is talking about it. So I have heard bits and pieces about it. I actually just left teaching a class, and it was brought up there in that class, you know. So from what I do understand is that it was not just the police involved, but the EMTs, and I think I even heard firefighters, but how, you know, apparently everyone has some wrongdoing. And it's, I think, perhaps the most, I don't want to say most prevalent piece, but one of the most an important piece to point out, especially as the Soul Focus group really talks about moving away from the anti-racism and the whole movement around that into a place of self-solidarity, or just a place of solidarity, is the fact that the officers in this case were all Black, with the exception, I believe, of one. And so I think that it calls into question a lot of things that we even talk about here, you know, that subconscious program, and then how across races that can happen, right? So it's generally an incident of white officers shooting Black people, but now we have a case where, you know, the victim and the officers are Black, and not only the officers, but the police department and the police chief, you know. So it's so much that's wrapped up in this that I think that there should be a national conversation around how we look at one another as humans in general, and then also how we look at each other within spectrum of race as well. As we know, then, you know, this racism is infectious in a way to where it goes across lines, and this has a lot to do with our subconscious programming and how we think that we draw the line at race, such as, oh, well, white officers do this as opposed to Black officers, right? And us really having this conversation on how does this happen to anyone, regardless of race, and why do we respond to things in such a way that ends with the life of someone being taken?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think, Anwar, that's a great question for you. You know, I asked your feeling about when you first saw the video, but what was your feeling when you saw and found out that this was all Black officers? What came up for you then?
You know, I would be hard pressed to say that I was not surprised. Because again, I've seen it and worked in it and been institutionalized by it too. But there was not that much of a difference for me. You know, even when I heard about it, I've gotten to a point in my life where when stuff like this happens, it's not that I don't pay attention, but the automatic thing that I don't question anymore is, were the officers white? You know, initially early on, even when I would start doing some social justice advocacy, early on, that is where my mind would go. That is what my first question would be: what was the race of the police officers, or what was the race of the firefighters, or whatever institution you want to talk about. That is the one thing that I would try to critically analyze first. When I was missing a key component that Christin just brought up, that this is infectious. None of us are immune to this. We like to think about it. We like to believe that. But none of us, as long as we're here breathing and living in this, in the way that this society is currently functioning, then we are not immune to it. At some point, we're going to end up catching it ourselves, and we don't question, well, what do I do next? All right. Like, we don't actually want to believe that. So no, I was not surprised. I was not shocked by it. I was not, again, I was more focused on the trauma and the high level of violence that was happening. I've come to understand that really, by and large, the way that, and life has taught me this, right? But the way that we start something typically determines how or what the outcome of that is going to be, and how that may end. So, for example, right off the bat, you hear the video, or you see and hear on the video the way that interaction started. It was already violent from the beginning. It was violent from the beginning. So many curse words, so many violent commands were given all at once by multiple officers. So to sit here and to say that I was shocked by what the outcome was going to be, that would be false for me to say. So no, I was not, not shocked, not surprised. It continues to call me for us to think about what level of human solidarity do we currently have, but also where are we at with our own self-solidarity process?
Right. So two things come up for me when you're talking. And, the first question is just about the violence and the trauma in general that you see every day as an officer. And then the second part of that is, as an officer of color, especially when you were policing primarily in communities of color, how does that trauma that's happening in communities of color, how does that start to impact you? How did it impact you? And how did you see it impacting your fellow officers of color?
It's multifaceted, right? We have to be able to look at it from multiple lenses here. One of those lenses is, as a police officer, one, you're asked to police a community that once you belonged in, probably, right? And then also, what is that going to do to those who you used to be in community with, right? So often, even police officers of color, policing communities of color, at times, it was like we were still the enemy, regardless of our own similarities in regards to the skin color, right? Or the race, or whatever we want to use. So one of those facets that I was talking about, or one of those faces, or one of those the things that we would quite often get, you still get treated as the enemy. At times we think that we're coming in, or personally, I can say that I would come in and I'm thinking, okay, because I am also a quote unquote minority, right? And I hate to use that word to begin with, but a person of color, I would come in and thinking, okay, there can be an automatic connection because we may look like each other, and there's that place of understanding. I was highly incorrect. Mm-hmm. It would actually almost trigger some people, and they would say, they would call us like sellouts, Uncle Toms. So at some point that starts to make you callous. That starts to make you almost want to work less in those communities because of the type of engagement and the type of interactions that you're getting. So that's one of the things that we would often see, or that I would often see. And then the other thing is, think about this. If you grew up in a community that has high violence and high trauma, and then you get placed to go work again in that community without healing from the previous trauma that you had before, what do you think that outcome is going to be? Again, it almost starts to turns you inside out. And now you're once again not only living it, seeing it, experiencing it, but also working in it. At some point, it truly starts to call you to question why you're even doing the job that you're doing to begin with. I recently had a conversation with a police officer friend of mine because I wanted to know, what are the conversations like around police departments now that I'm not in it anymore. Because every time there's an incident like this in the United States, obviously, and during the roll call rooms or coffee breaks, officers talk. So I was highly intrigued on, like, what are the conversations like? Have they changed from Michael Brown, from other victims like that? Have they changed much? And not really. And I began questioning, like, if the conversations haven't shifted, or if officers are wanting to still justify this type of incident, or try to create a motive or a reason why things happen the way that they happen, then those officers ought to be questioning the reason why they do what they do. Because one cannot sit here and try to justify something like that, or try to come up with a reason or a motive, or try to say that officers maybe felt a sense of threat to be able to paint a better picture for policing. And then again, maybe if you're an individual that does that, you should sit back down a bit in silence within yourself and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Because after watching that video, Martin and Christin, I sat for a little bit and I asked myself, how do those officers that were involved in that, even those that were not directly involved, those that were also indirectly involved, how did they go home to their families? How do they have dinner the next day with their families, or how do they have lunch? How do they look at their kids and put the uniform back on and think that they're going back into the community to do anything that is good for the community?
Thank you for posing that question. And as somebody that was in that situation, how did you do it? I mean, I know you weren't ever involved in anything like this, but I have talked to you a lot, and I know you saw and were involved in really horrifically violent acts. How did you do that? How did you go home to your family? And also, how did you go on to a traffic stop, or how did you go on to the next, more minor policing? I'm really curious about that.
You ask a very good question, Martin. You ask a question that I think, by and large, officers throughout this nation could probably really be able to self-reflect on this question. But really, anyone that is in part of any type of system that deals with people, that deals with humans, which is about just anybody. But I would say you build this thing that ultimately leads you to disassociating yourself from your human self, that calls you to really put a uniform on that almost turns you into a robot. Because, you asked the question of how do you also go from that type of call to then another call? Well, you go to those calls in that order by not even thinking about the people that you just dealt with in the previous call. Those people really become those faces, those names, those individuals, those scars, those victims, those suspects, everything. It just becomes a call number. And now we're going to call number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, depending on the type of police department that you work for. But that's how you're able to function. Otherwise, if initially, and I experienced this initially, once I started to taking that all in through my human self, I quickly experienced something that's called empathy fatigue. I became tired. I became cold. I became numb. So to be able to function and to be able to actually continue to move forward, you have to disassociate yourself. You have to put your human side. So I had to put Anuar Velazquez on the back seat and put Officer Velazquez in the front seat that drives to calls, that just deals with calls and then moves on to the other thing. But I would say for me, that's how it functioned. And that's how I was able to function in a very unhealthy way.
So it's not really functioning. It's surviving essentially, right? You're just getting by. And when you talk about a robot, it's like, yeah, but what if it's like a robot that we program trauma into, right? PTSD. It's a robot with PTSD. So it's not a emotionless robot. It's a sort of a time bomb robot is what I'm thinking. And it makes me think why something like that can happen. Well, what happened in Memphis can happen is because you're going along robotically, you're dissociating, but you're not, like you said several times, you're not healing. So it's not like that trauma and that PTSD isn't there. It's just, I think the way you said it is really well spoken. Like it's just in the back seat, but it can pop up in the front seat at any time. And that trauma is waiting to come out. It's not gone.
No, absolutely. And this starts from the beginning. That's why I brought up the word institutionalization earlier. This happens right off the bat. I mean, even in the police academy, right? And then the military does this. In the police academy, we would go on long runs. And we had something that was called cadence, right? So the way that you ran, we all had to be in cadence. We all had to be in rhythm. Left foot, left, right. And I still remember then we were being pulled away from our human self. And I say that because of the stuff that I was experiencing. We had officers that were not so good at it. We had officers that could not keep rhythm. And we worked them to a point where they finally, I wouldn't say they found it, because I'm sure if those officers were able to step on the dance floor again, they may not have so much rhythm. But they found it then to be able to be part of this system. They were able to find their left foot, right foot again as we all ran together to be able to be a part of that system. So this association of yourself, of your human self, starts from the beginning. So again, I go back to that idea that the way that we start something typically determines how the outcome would be or how it will end.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
come to the Soul Focus Group, you come to an acknowledgement that there has been injuries done to us from all these different forms of oppression. Injuries that have impacted our subconscious mind, our heart, our spirit, our very soul. So at the Soul Focus Group, we recognize that and we focus on healing. Healing, the return or the recovery of our connections to our healthy self, our beautiful thinking mind. We want you to come join us in a movement of healing all around the world to restore us back to our rightful state. At the Soul Focus Group, we heal.
Christin, I just wonder if there's any questions or anything that's coming up for you that you want to ask or add in right now.
I'm taking it all in. I think, and I've been sitting with how to articulate this, when it comes to the racial matters, because when I initially saw this story, I would say that I saw something that was quite disturbing. So I first saw this story on Instagram on the Shade Room, and the Shade Room posted a picture of all of the officers. I think it was, well, at least there were 5 Black officers. And they said that all of the officers had been terminated. And so as I started reading the comments, most of the comments were saying things like, oh, well, why did they get terminated? They got terminated because they're Black. If they had been white, then they would have been put on leave. And it was like comment after comment that was saying this. And I had responded and I was just like, I mean, damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Like, how is this a conversation? So we have stirred up race so much in this country that even though, technically that was the right thing for them to do, I suppose, was to fire them, to terminate them, right? And now people are questioning why they were fired instead of put on leave because they were Black, and making this comparison. And so I think that this is a much bigger conversation in that context to around what do we even want? What do we want to happen? We don't want these incidents to happen at all. And so I'm wondering, why the comparison? Why do we compare in this case? That's generally, I would think that that's what people would expect, with that if officers did something against what they were supposed to do, that they would be terminated. But they immediately did this comparison between them being Black officers and white officers and the different treatment between the two. Why do you think that might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think even as you mentioned, I've seen stuff like that floating around as well. The conversation or the debate around race, and would that have a different impact? The other thing that I've also seen flowing around or going around is, if those officers were white, there would be more riots and there would be more city downtown buildings being burnt down and all of this. That's what I've seen. And it just makes me really more perplexed that we continue to fall for this fallacy of race. We continue to fall for this really idea of race in the lens of division, right? Because we didn't focus, like, those comments or those posts, they're not focusing on the violent thing that happened. They're focusing more on the outcome of what these officers may have to face. Let me ask you this. If those officers, instead of being terminated, if they were put on paid leave, would that change anything that happened to the young man? The answer to that is simple: no, it would not. Of course. But as society, right, we have been put in this place of going back and forth through this racial divide that, again, we lose the human aspect of it all. In my experience as a police officer, I've seen white officers do stuff like that. I've seen officers of color do stuff like that. And we have to remember, it all has to be treated case by case. In this case specifically, it was so cut and dry. So cut and dry in the sense of, you had the body camera, you had the pole camera. that indicated and that showed the extreme violent things that were happening to this young man. So could that be a reason why these officers were terminated so quickly? Maybe. I also think about where officers being more quickly terminated with stuff like this to appease the community and not allow the community to go in complete mayhem or disruption, possibly. But again, those type of questions allow us to actually divert or really move away from the more critical questions that we should be asking. They move us away from the true, authentic stuff that we ought to be looking for, which is the continuous violence and continuous trauma that we're experiencing as a society as a whole. Anyone that watched this video received some level of trauma, but instead our mind and our brain went to why were they so quickly terminated? Why were they so quick? If they were white officers, would this have happened? Like those types of things. It continues to show us the need for true human solidarity.
Right. Absolutely. And, that's such a good question, Christin. And, we talk about groundwater and subconscious programming all the time. Part of the way I think about it is there may be something in the subconscious programming of somebody who makes the decision who to fire, who not to, right? Just like we know there's something in the subconscious programming about who to shoot on and who not to shoot on that's racialized. And we also know what I keep thinking about with your question and Anuar with your answer is, a long time ago, I learned that anytime a human being is racialized, no matter what racial value they're given, they're dehumanized. Mm-hmm. So by racializing every situation, it dehumanizes the situation. Mm-hmm. And I really heard you just say that. It's like at the core of this were humans that took the life of another human. And, what do you think, and I'm not asking you to put yourself in their minds, but in your experience, what do you think is going on in the groundwater of those officers in terms of did you experience most officers, especially officers of color, coming from their own unhealed trauma? And then, what's the groundwater on that situation that comes up for them? So what's that old groundwater? And then how do you deal with that situation? You kind of brought it up earlier, but I really want to hear you talk about it in what you were just saying. Like part of what we need to do is we need to humanize everybody in this circumstance, not just humanize the person that was killed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things that I want to start by saying is that there is such a true thing to the pedagogy of the oppressed, right? That the oppressed becomes mm-hmm. the oppressor. And we hardly truly critically look into that, right? How have we become that as well? When you ask the question about the trauma and unhealed trauma and how does it show up and how is it present or how is it prevalent with those officers, I think about this often, right? I think about the trauma that I experienced myself as a young kid, trauma that I experienced myself in my young adulthood life, and then going into policing. One of the things that I failed to recognize is that I would often see myself in those communities. And if you're seeing yourself in those communities through the lens of trauma, are you going to want to heal it, or are you going to want to actually put it to the side or continue to suppress it, right? And often I found myself continuing to suppress it. Even though I saw myself in the community, I never saw myself in the humanity of the community. I saw myself in the trauma of the community. So with that being said, oftentimes, even those that face trauma, they beat themselves up. And that's what I was doing. That's what I was doing with those communities. And I'm not saying physically in the literal sense of physically, but I was beating them up without realizing it. Because again, I saw myself in those communities, or I saw myself in the community through the lens of trauma.
And Anuar, what's in place? What's in place in the police department to deal with that, to help officers deal with their own unhealed trauma and then the trauma of what they see on a day-to-day basis? What's in place to help break that cycle of trauma?
In my experience throughout the time that I was a police officer, and I would have to do some research, and I don't know that this has changed much because, again, it's an institution that really calls you to be part of this brotherhood and all this other stuff. But there was not much in place at all. Talks around the table or talks in the locker room or talks around your squad car were those that were not healing. If anything, they were making fun of making light of calls that we went on. That's not healing at all whatsoever. There was really not a brotherhood of holding each other accountable to truly be able to support each other mentally. But no, there's not much in place. There was not much in place then. And I don't want to speak without doing much research, but I would almost bet to say that there's not much in place still now. At times they would give you the opportunity to quote unquote get some help, but in such a male toxic driven environment, that stuff was viewed as less than, or as not being strong enough, or being weak. And in a field where weaknesses are preyed upon, you don't want to show that at all. So, unfortunately, there was just not much of that happening. There was not that much support for those officers. So again, I think about Memphis and what I know about Memphis and their crime rate and stuff like that. Without knowing those individuals, knowing those police officers that were involved in this, I can't imagine the type of trauma. If I know the type of trauma that I went through, the stuff that I witnessed, the calls that I went on, I am sure that can be multiplied times 100 in a place like Memphis. Mm-hmm. And again, when you're a police officer and you see yourself in that community through the lens of trauma, then trauma is going to be placed upon the community.
Yeah, it's some of the statistics are just mind-boggling. In 2021 they had 345 homicides, 346. And last year 289 homicides, 25 of those being children, and 150 children being wounded by gunfire. Mm-hmm. So, it's an incredibly violent place for sure. And I can't get away in our conversation from the circular nature of it, the way that the trauma and the violence just keeps cycling between community and police. And one of the things I've heard you say really clearly is that there's not as much difference oftentimes, especially in officers of color, between the community and the police than we might think. That you keep talking about how for you in some ways have more connection to the community, and you saw yourself in that community a lot. So there really isn't a lot of separation, like you were saying.
Mm-hmm. I vividly recall a time when I was patrolling through a neighborhood. And again, I patrolled neighborhoods that were by and large Black and Latino. And I remember going through a neighborhood, had my window down. It was in the middle of the summer. And I see a young kid, I would say by the age of maybe 3 or 4 years old, sitting on the steps outside of his home, and who would appear to be maybe his father outside of the home. Again, I can't assume. I waved at the kid. The kid tried to wave back at me, and the male figure that was standing next to the kid smacked his hand and put it down. Again, we think about those pieces of connection. I'm there patrolling. My lights were not on. I'm not looking for anybody. I'm just there patrolling. And I try to be that police officer that truly got to know the people that lived in the beat that I worked in. I really tried to create that connection, but at times you're met with that. So again, it just puts you in this place it puts you back in the place of survival, because at the end of the day too, you have to feed your family. So one can talk about, I want to do these things, but at some point you have to pause and you have to pump the brakes and think about, okay, if I continue to go down this route, is it going to lead me to a place where I really won't be able to come back to my family? So there's just so much going on. And you asked the question of what's in place for police officers to be able to work through this, to be able to function, and to be able to actually move away from survival mode to living. My question, especially after you read out loud the data and the statistics of Memphis, again, the critical question is what's in place for those children that have been victims of gun violence? What's been put in place for those families who have lost a member of their family to gun violence? Those are the statistics, or that is the data that we should be looking for. That is the stuff that we really have to analyze to get to the root of it. Otherwise, we can put more aggressive units like this, and those have been proven to really create the stuff that happened in Memphis, unfortunately. But we can put more police officers in the beats. We can patrol the areas a little bit more. That's just a Band-Aid. That's a Band-Aid over something that was cut by a chainsaw.
You asked a question that I was thinking of too. And Christin, I wonder if you could jump back in here, and because I know you grew up in some neighborhoods that that are pretty similar to this neighborhood in Memphis, and I'm just wondering, your answer to that question: what's in place in those communities for people to deal with these cycles of trauma that are happening, both external from police, but also internal, with the gun violence. And I'm wondering if Christin, if you could comment on what you see, if anything, that's in place to deal with that trauma from the community side.
Yeah, Martin. So I actually visited Memphis about 3 times this past year, and I spent a considerable amount of time there each time when I went. Like, I was there for a couple of weeks at a time. So I really got a good feel for Memphis, and it is very similar to Cleveland in many ways. Just, of course, the demographics being one, but just the layout and the makeup of Memphis. Cleveland also has a black police chief, and so it's in terms of the community and what's being put into place. I would say that there are actually a lot of things that are put into place. I mean, the conversation around mental health and even violence has been more of a popular and even more popular and growing conversation around how to deal with traumas, how to deal with violence that happens in a community, whether it is programming through institutions. Here in Cleveland, we have something called ghetto therapy that was started by a community activist who I've known for years, who lives and works in a predominantly black neighborhood and in a neighborhood that has seen a lot of violence. And part of his solution was bringing people together every week and then having therapists on staff to work with people through trauma. So I actually would say that there are a lot of resources around that. However, I always redirect back to our soul, and from a very spiritual place. There can be these physical things that are available for support, and that's fine. But I think all of this goes back to the disconnection that we have within ourselves, because the disconnection that we have within ourselves is what makes us be violent with one another in the first place. And so the programming that I've seen is always more so built around systems and what can systems be doing to help people. But where are the conversations around personal development, and how do people personally connect with themselves, be in solidarity with themselves first? And if there was more focus on that, then we probably wouldn't see a lot of violence, and we wouldn't see a lot of the other problems that we have, because people would be in solidarity with themselves first, and therefore with other humans. And so we try to do it from the reverse way, which doesn't yield many results. And this will just keep happening again, whether it's police violence or police killings and police shootings. Anuar is absolutely correct to say that is how people aren't necessarily so friendly to you, just because of the narrative that has been built around the police and the community. There, in my opinion, should be more of a focus on personal development and accountability. And that's that self-solidarity piece, because that's the prerequisite for any other healing, is that we have to heal on an individual. So we have to heal on an individual level first and find value within self first. And we wouldn't harm anyone else if we had that sense of self-solidarity.
Thank you, Christin. And Anuar, I know we're coming up on the time because you have to go back to your job, but can you respond to that and maybe just leave us with a final thought in terms of what the concept of self-solidarity and pouring into yourself could look like in the realm of policing that might stop continuing events like this from happening?
No, absolutely. I agree with Christin in the way that she sees some of this stuff. Again, I think about the current narratives that some police officers or some people even in society are having those internal conversations about the incidents that occurred. And I question and I wonder how close are those conversations to self-solidarity? Because again, our goal is to get to that collective piece, the human solidarity. So if we're sitting here, or if you as a listener is sitting here and you're thinking about this incident through the lens of the racial component so much, not to ignore race, but you're thinking more about like, what if, or these officers were white, or whatever. Again, that conversation is not leading to self-solidarity. That conversation is not really getting to the root of it. So as a collective, if we want to get to the human solidarity piece, I'm in agreement with what Christin mentioned. It's in that community how much self-solidarity work is being done, how much work is being done with those systems and institutions, how much work is being done at the educational level, at the community level of one another. Because again, if they're functioning as a community, as a collective, have they come to understand themselves as individuals before they even be part of that community? And if not, again, if you're going into a community with trauma, you're going to traumatize a community. So for those officers that may listen to this podcast, what type of self-solidarity work have you done yourself to then lead that into the collective environment for those communities that you're there to patrol and that you're there to keep safe and to maintain peace and order?
Thank you, Anuar, and thank you, Christin. You know, what I'm thinking about right now is that in order to see ourselves and other people, we have to be in solidarity with ourselves. We have to be in a place of love with ourselves. And clearly, these incidences happen because we don't see ourselves in each other, just like all of those murders that are happening in Memphis and happening in Cleveland and happening all over this country are happening because we're not seeing ourselves in each other. So and that's on a human level. It's not just on a race or gender or class level, but that's on a human level. So, man, this has been an amazing conversation. Anuar, I want to thank you for taking the time and bringing your perspective. We very well might have a follow-up conversation to this, but Anuar and Christin, I want to thank you both for being with me today and having this conversation.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you to all the listeners. Again, take care of yourself and do some meditation every once in a while.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the both of you and this conversation.
My genius, my power, my optimal functioning. My genius, my power, my optimal functioning. Repeat after me. My genius, my power, my optimal functioning. That is the jingle of the Soul Focus Group, because we are dedicated to helping you recover your genius, your power, and your optimal functioning. We want you to recognize the unique way that you comprehend things, express yourself, experience, and create in the world. We want to help you recover your genius, your power, your optimal functioning.
Well, I hope that was a good experience for you to listen to it. I think it's incredibly powerful to listen to the perspective of both Anuar and Christin. And I'm just really holding a lot of sadness right now that this is what's going on in our world, and that, you know, our default is to violence, our default is to death, and our default is to not seeing the humanity in each other. We are very glad that you're on the journey with us. We want to thank you for listening to this episode, making it to this point in the episode. Know that we love you and care about you. We honestly and truly see a way out. And the way out is a soul-focused way, out of ego and into soul. And as I said, that's our journey. And we are beyond excited and honored that you're on this journey with us. Please go to soulfocusgroup.com. Please follow us, like us on YouTube, help us grow, share this episode with people, with your circles. It'll be posted on social media if you want to comment, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. We look forward to continuing this discussion and all of our discussions with you moving forward. So with that, we ask you, as always, please stay safe in all that means to you. Stay well in all that means to you. And most of all, stay soul focused.